Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's deep dive into Ryzen 2, the 2600, 2600X, 2700, and 2700X that just launched in April of 2018. This is going to be a long video. More than 50 slides are incoming, so grab some coffee, some Red Bull, or whatever you need, sit back, relax, and prepare for a very long voiceover of the entire AMD press slide presentation with my comments, observations, notes, and a little bit of humor on everything to do with these new processors, the new motherboards, some new technologies that came with them, and some recommendations. If you want a deep, detailed look at everything to do with these processors, you've come to the right place. If you want to see my launch review, that'll be linked down in the description below. It's much shorter than this, and you can get some benchmark numbers there as well. But this is for somebody who wants the complete look. Also linked in the video description below will be links to all 4 new processors and the APUs as well as motherboards to both Amazon and Newegg. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. If you found this deep dive useful, helpful, and informative, please use those when shopping. It really does make a difference. And with that being said, on with the video. First of all, we're starting with the second slide of AMD's presentation, not the first because, well, this one's prettier to look at. Second generation AMD Ryzen desktop processor. Yes, it's a lovely logo. That brings us to actually the first slide of it, which is cautionary statement. Now, this is a legal investor statement. I won't read it to you, but the gist of it is, while there's many statements in these slides that are forward-looking and projecting, such as AM4 support until 2020, these aren't actually guaranteed, and legally they have an out if they have to change it for any reason. Yes, I know, boring legal language. Next slide. Now, this one is important. Ryzen changed high-end computing in 2017, and that was absolutely true. I said when Ryzen launched last year in March of 2017, it was the most important desktop processor launch in 10 years. I was correct then, and I stand behind that statement. It has moved the entire industry. Raise your hands in the audience if you believe we would have 6-core and upcoming 8-core Coffee Lake processors if Ryzen hadn't changed the business. It is worth noting that prior to Ryzen launching, Intel was charging $1,000 for an 8-core 16-thread processor, and yeah, now they're not. So that is a big, big change. The other big change is the fact that 4-core has now become entry-level. i3s used to be 2-core 4-thread. Now i3s are 4-core. It is worth noting that they now provide a 4-core 4-thread 3.7 gigahertz processor with actually good integrated graphics for $99. That would have been unthinkable just a year ago. This is a marketing recap slide from AMD, and it's all true, except some of it matters more than others. 40% plus market share at strategic e-tailers in third quarter 2017. That's not a cherry-picked number, but the reality is Ryzen is in fact selling very well, and it is very competitive compared to the old FX processors. Ryzen Threadripper is an amazing thing. For $1,000, they are offering you 16 true processing cores, 32 threads, for the same money that Intel just a year ago wanted for 8 processing cores and 16 threads. It is also a better platform with 64 PCI Express lanes, quad-channel RAM, and a bunch of other things. It really is interesting. Ryzen Pro is not important whatsoever to anybody watching my videos, and Ryzen Mobile has not taken off the way a lot of people were hoping it would. Yes, Ryzen Mobile chips launched last year, and yes, they do exist, but not enough main companies have really made it a thing to get much penetration. Now, this slide is a bit of a recap of what I just said a minute ago about the fact that Ryzen being the most important CPU launch in 10 years. Intel launched the Core 2 Quad 10 years ago, and it has not basically changed on the desktop since. It has been possible for Intel to do 6 cores, 12 threads on the desktop for a long, long time. After all, look at the X5875 and other chip series that go into the very old X58 motherboards, and yet we never really got consumer processors at that level because Intel had no reason to give them to us, and then poof, Ryzen comes along, and 6 months later we have 6-core Coffee Lake. Now that we've got 8-core processors, it is all but confirmed that there will be 8-core 16-thread Coffee Lake chips later in the year. BioStar has leaked Z 390 chipsets. Yes, another new chipset. What can I say? That's probably coming in third or fourth quarter of 2018. Intel, of course, has not confirmed any of this, but it's pretty well known at this point. Now, on the laptop, AMD likes to talk about the fact that they've now moved to quad-core on mobile, and that's true, but again, they have not had the same level of market penetration that they have on the desktop. For whatever reason, companies love slides like this. It's filler and lets the presenter talk for a bit, and that's pretty much what they do, but I won't do that, so next slide. So far for 2018, in January, we got Ryzen processors for laptops with Vega graphics, which again have not had a huge market penetration, but they do certainly exist. Then in February, we got the Ryzen APUs, although they don't call them APUs anymore. They've dropped that term, mostly because the previous APUs were pretty subpar. Now we have Ryzen processor with Radeon Vega graphics, which frankly I think APU is a better term. That is the 2200G and the 2400G, which I've done a bunch of benchmarks on. In fact, I have 17 different game performance videos with live gameplay on the 2200G on my channel. Those are impressive processors, and the value for the money is extreme. It is worth noting those are the new low-end chips. There are no low-end mainstream Ryzen chips without integrated graphics. Ryzen 3 2200G replaced the 1200 and the 1300X, and the Ryzen 5 2400G replaced the 1400 and 1500X. The mainstream processors that have now launched, Ryzen 5 2600, 2600X and up, are all 6 or 8 core chips. Ryzen Pro mobile processors are launching, which means nothing to any of you, and the second generation Ryzen Pro processors in second half again means nothing. That's a business certification thing, it's a quality control thing for companies and large organizations. None of those mean anything. The next major launch you're going to see in 2018 is second generation Threadripper. Expect similar performance gains along with Ryzen 1 to Ryzen 2, which is higher clock speeds, improved memory support, another motherboard, probably X499 I would imagine, but that's coming in the second half of 2018. And of course, if you already have a Threadripper, it's probably not going to be worth upgrading, just like Ryzen 1 to 2 is generally not worth upgrading, but if you've been holding out or thinking about it, that is coming probably in 6 months' time. Another slide basically saying the same thing I said before, 2400G and 2200G, amazing value for the money. I give both of these two thumbs up. They may very well be the deal of 2018, even with the new Ryzen chips launched. The truth is, for $99, you get 4 cores, 4 threads, and good integrated graphics at the NVIDIA GT 1030 or close to it level. Because that graphics card is basically $100, you're almost getting a free CPU. I would like to point out that a year ago, to get 4 cores, 4 threads from Intel, you had to buy an i5 7400 for $180, and it has terrible integrated graphics, and this does not. So this is a huge value for the money. Now that was last year, and it's not the comparison that AMD wants to make. Instead, they're looking at the current generation i5 8400, comparing it to a Ryzen 5 2400G. Please note this is not apples to apples. i5 8400 is 6 cores, 6 threads. Ryzen 5 2400G is 4 cores, 8 threads, so it straddles it. But with the integrated graphics that comes with it, it absolutely is GT 1030 worthy, and so yeah, look at the value for the money. There are a couple of caveats here. In the United States, an i5 8400 is not $199. You can find them for about $175 plus or minus $5. But it's also worth noting the Ryzen 5 2400G has also been discounted, and you can regularly find it on Amazon and Newegg for about $10 less than this. The GT 1030 has actually been over $100 for a lot of 2018 because of cryptocurrency miners, but it's starting to come back down. But this entire argument misses the point. For basically lower price than just the CPU, you get the CPU plus really good graphics. Have I mentioned what a good deal the Ryzen desktop processor with Radeon Vega graphics? Actually, I just noticed at the top of the page it does say Ryzen desktop APU. Is this the first time I've seen that from AMD? Because they actually went out of their way to say, we're calling these CPUs with Vega graphics. So there you go, the APU's right on the page. And another fluff slide, because that's what these companies do, but it's not just AMD. To be honest with you, I've seen the slides from Intel, they do the same thing. Ryzen doubling down for enthusiasts. Well, yes and no, but it is in fact an improvement. Here is a summary slide of a lot of information, and they will talk about this later in various slides in more detail, but here's the summary. Higher clock speeds, yes. Precision Boost 2, yes. Lower latencies on the more performance is actually probably the most important. Soldered integrated heat spreader, yes, thank goodness. Now the APUs are not soldered and so they have less overclockability, but these are soldered and that's what really matters. The new Wraith Prism cooler, which we'll talk about in a minute, yes, that matters. The new chipset, less so. StoreMI technology, I will probably do a video on that. The truth of the matter is the big changes here are more about an evolution rather than a revolution. But it is a refinement in many respects, and yay, coolers included finally. Now this slide exists primarily because this was a pre-briefing before launch, which I actually didn't receive. I got this about 12 hours before launch day because I wasn't included in the launch, but they did send me a copy to make a video on, so I appreciate that. Now, the Ryzen 7 2700X at $329 suggested retail price in the United States is the cream of the crop processor. The Ryzen 5 2600X is also worth considering. It's $100 less at $229. I personally believe that most people should skip the non-X chips this time around, and so does AMD, which is why AMD did not sample those to any of the reviewers. They only sent out the X chips. Now, I have bought both the non-X chips, and I will show you side-by-side comparisons, but the truth is companies sample what they really believe is going to sell. Intel, for example, sampled the i5 8400 and the i7 8700K. They did not sample the i5 8600K because even Intel knows that's a pretty stupid processor. Because frankly, if you're going to go to a K chip and overclock and put liquid cooling on it and go high end, you're buying an i7, or you should. Same thing here. There's only a $30 price difference. The coolers on the X chips are better. Wraith Prism and Wraith Spire on the two X chips versus the Wraith Spire and then the Wraith Stealth on the two non-X chips 7 and 5 respectively. Higher clocks, better binning, better coolers, guaranteed performance for 10% more money by the X processors. Regardless of anything else, well, I don't think I need it, or does it really matter? Just buy the X chips. That's really what AMD is selling here. AMD is now going to compare the Ryzen 7 2700X to the i7 8700K. This is a marketing slide designed, of course, to make them look good, which is why the gaming performance number here is at 1440p and not 1080p. Let me just help you out. At 1080p, the i7 8700K is 10 to 15% faster than the Ryzen 7 2700X. But we are, however, comparing hundreds of frames per second to hundreds of frames per second on high-end video cards, less so on lower-end video cards, but then the gap narrows a bit when you have a lower-end video. If you have a 3GB GTX 1060, there's not a 10 to 15% performance difference if you have detail at high or ultra because you're more GPU limited. Put a 1080 Ti in and yes, that's true, but then you're really getting into a corner case in the market. The number of people who are going to buy a $350 processor, a 1080 Ti to play at 1080p to guarantee 144 frames per second or get as close to it as possible is a very small slice of the market. Fine, if you're that person, yes, 8700K might make sense. For everyone else on Earth, Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7, the X chips make more sense. Now, the creative performance number here is fair, true, and accurate. The reality is, for non-gaming applications, for content creation, 3D animation, video rendering, video editing, don't knock trying to scrub 4K 60 frame per second video in Adobe Premiere Pro. Even on a 6-core processor, if you have a lot of effects or multiple video feeds in there, it really can slow down. 8-core 16 threads does make a difference, and that's why I transitioned to Ryzen 7 last year from my 6-core 12-thread Broadwell E. I did notice a difference. Premiere Pro in edit, not just render, but in edit was smoother and easier to work with, so it really does make a difference. Live streaming, again, the lower latencies in the 8 cores helps, especially for AAA games. There's a lot to like about the 2700X. The only real deficiency it has is 1080p, over 100 plus frames per second gaming with a 1080 Ti. The primary comparison here is the Ryzen 7 2700X to the i7 8700K. The 2700X comes with an excellent premium cooler, roughly equivalent to a Hyper 212 Evo in terms of cooling capability, whereas the i7 8700K doesn't come with a cooler at all, and you would have to buy one. Now, a Hyper 212 actually will cool a i7 8700K just fine at stock speeds at 4.3 gigahertz, but it certainly will not let you get much overclocking taking out of it. It also costs more. Not quite the $369 suggested retail price that's here, but it's still about $20 or $30 more expensive than the Ryzen. It also tends to take more expensive motherboards, but not terribly so, because I would not install a 2700X on an under $100 motherboard, even though you can, I wouldn't. In some respects, I wouldn't make this comparison. I would actually compare the Ryzen 5 2600X to the i7 8700K because they're both 6 cores, 12 threads. The clock speeds are similar. Okay, the Ryzen's a little slower, but in most games, you're going to get virtually the same gaming performance whether you have the Ryzen 5 or the Ryzen 7. And the Ryzen 5 2600X is $229 instead of $329, and that chip, yes, I would install on less expensive motherboards. Now, part of this slide was already shown earlier, so I won't go into too much detail other than to say that the two main things here that matter are the higher clock speeds and the lower latencies. Yes, it's the first 12 nanometer processor, big deal. How does that translate into performance? Well, it does make it higher clock speeds and it does allow them to optimize it, but that doesn't really matter to the end user. The truth of the matter is, it is a refinement of the first generation Ryzen, not an evolution, but it is faster and it is better. Just to be clear, Ryzen 7 2700X is faster than the Ryzen 7 1800X of the previous generation for a whole lot less money. Now, this part right here is going to be overlooked in a lot of the initial reviews and frankly a lot of coverage because people have been trained to look at clock speed only. The better cache latency across the chip, the better memory latency is just as important as the actual clock speed itself. Clock for clock, the Ryzen 7 2700X is going to feel faster and be more responsive than a Ryzen 7 1700 or 1800X, even at the same clock speeds because of this right here. Now, is it going to magically make your benchmarks faster? No. Is it going to make video renders faster? No. It makes the system more responsive and snappy. It basically kicks it up a notch and just makes everything run a little bit smoother and a little bit cleaner. It's not a revolution, but it is a very nice evolution. More hype about the 12 nanometer processor, it does lift the clock speeds. However, I do take exception to the all-core overclocks are now around 4.2 gigahertz. On the Wraith Prism cooler that's included, my Ryzen 7 2700X does not run at 4.2 gigahertz when all the cores are being used. Even in a non-AVX workload, just stressing the CPU, I get about 4 gigahertz out of it. Now, with a high-end aftermarket cooler, would it go faster? Yes. Is it possible to get 4.2 gigahertz on all the cores? Yes. Don't bother. It's a 5% clock speed difference. You're looking at a 2 to 3% real-world performance difference. These are actually fairly minor variations. So while they pitch that as what it's capable of, I ran stress testing on this for hours, both in just CPU usage as well as AVX FPU usage, and I wasn't seeing 4.2 gigahertz with the included Wraith Prism cooler. I have not, as of the recording of this video, put a Noctua D15 on this yet, but I will. But of course, that makes no sense. That's a $90 tower cooler, and if it takes $90 to get 3% more performance, that's a poor value for the money. That $90 should be put into graphics card, SSD, RAM, or something else. But yes, I suppose it's technically possible with enough cooling. This is a marketing slide if there ever was one. There is truth in this. It is an improved platform. It does use less power per watt, but these results are awfully darn cherry-picked. So just keep in mind that all the companies are guilty of doing this, but the power draw at the same clock is the Ryzen 5 chips, and then the performance at the same power are the Ryzen 7 non-X chips. So we've got both X and non-X and 6-core and 8-core to demonstrate. The point is they specifically picked this to give the best looking numbers on a chart. All the other chips are likely to have not this much improvement. They will have an improvement. Just keep in mind that when you're looking at marketing charts, you're generally looking at the absolute best case scenario because they're trying to sell processors. This does not take away from how good Ryzen really is. I do recommend it, but marketing. Another marketing slide, and for those of you wondering, why am I pitching the marketing and why am I even including marketing slides instead of just talking about the core features as they matter to you? I'm doing every slide in this presentation and sharing with you my take on everything that AMD provided. I don't see a lot of other people doing it. It's a deep dive, and I certainly hope you appreciate it. Left side, multi-threaded performance. X chips. Right side, performance per watt, non-X chips, and the non-K chip from Intel. So again, they're not wrong, and these are true numbers, but they're picking specific chips to basically demonstrate each point that they want to make. Now, I can actually show you Intel slides, and I should have actually. Next time Intel launches a product and I have this set of slides, I'll do this assuming you guys like this and it gets views, I'll do this same type of video and break those down. So I'm not playing favorites, but just do keep in mind that when they present a slide like this and half the slide is X chips and the other half isn't, they are in fact picking the results that tell the story they want to tell. If it helps, my Ryzen 7 1700 that I built back in March of 2017 and that I used up until I replaced it with a Skylake X because Intel was nice enough to send me one. Now, would I have bought one to replace it? No, but they did, so I did. It is faster. But the Ryzen 7 1700 is still downstairs and I still use it every day. I didn't retire it, I didn't get rid of it. It's still incredible value for the money and it really is good enough for 4K 60 frame per second video editing. It's about 25% slower than the Skylake X 8-core chip that I have, but the truth is it's really only 25% slower in render speed. Editing is about the same and everything else is about the same, and frankly, if I were buying a machine with my own personal money, Ryzen really is the best deal. So don't take my criticism of marketing slides to in any way, shape, or form dissuade you from buying a Ryzen, because if I had to pick between a Ryzen 7 2700X and an i7 8700K today, it's the Ryzen 7 all day long. AMD's SenseMI technology actually sort of existed in Ryzen 1 as well, but they've updated it. Now it's extended frequency range 2 and precision boost 2. Yay, number increments. This is actually real stuff. It does make a difference, but at the end of the day, what you care about is the overall performance, not what fancy technologies are inside the chip. It just matters how well and how smoothly do your programs run, and this stuff all helps with that. Now, Precision Boost 2 is worth another slide, and of all the little SenseMI technologies, it is worth noting that this is the most improved, in my opinion, versus Ryzen 1. In Ryzen 1, basically you had a 1 or 2 core boost speed, and then it dropped down beyond that. So, for example, a Ryzen 7 1800X, beyond about 2 cores, was always going to run at only 3.7 gigahertz out of the box. There really wasn't any fine-grained improvement as basically the core count increased. Now there is. They've removed the limitations and made Precision Boost what it should have been in the first place, which is it continues to boost the chip until it runs either into a voltage limit, power delivery limit, or temperature limit. What this means in net effective terms is the CPU is already overclocking itself about as well as it can given the cooler that you have installed, the ambient air temperature, the power delivery available on your motherboard, etc. This is also why I would not recommend putting a 2700X on a cheap $60 or $80 B350 board. The power delivery isn't as good, the VRMs aren't as good. You really want a better board because you're going to get a smoother, better power delivery. We are in fact running 8 cores, 16 threads at over 4 gigahertz at times. That does make a difference. As you can see here, we've got clock speeds between 4.0 and 4.2, anywhere from all the threads down to just 2 to 4 threads. In typical workloads between 4 and 8 threads, you're looking at about 4.1 gigahertz. Go to 8 threads or beyond, and you're starting to drop down to 4 gigahertz, which is what I saw during my stress test when all 16 threads were fully loaded. But what this does mean is that if you put a better cooler on the CPU, you'll get an extra 1 or 200 megahertz out of the chip. If you already own a better cooler and you're planning on using it, you will get a small boost. I would not, however, go out and just buy a better cooler just to get another 100 megahertz out of the chip. This is a comparison video they provided basically to show you what I described before, the 3.7 gigahertz on the Ryzen 7 1800X. Once you got beyond a couple of cores, it just dropped down to 3.7 and there it ran. It didn't have any grain or basic adjustment to it. It works differently in the sense that now it runs as fast as it can within the limits of temperature, power delivery, and voltage. This basically means that overclocking the chip manually is in fact pretty pointless unless you dramatically upgrade your cooling or you want to tweak the settings or manually override the voltage and punch a bunch more voltage into your chip, which I don't recommend. It will work, but you will shorten the life, you'll increase power consumption dramatically, you'll increase heat generation dramatically. You basically pay a lot of heat, temperature, noise, power consumption for another 100 or 200 megahertz at most, even on superior high-end cooling systems. Just buy it and run it at stock speeds, because at quote stock speeds, it is auto overclocking itself on a per thread basis as far as it can with basically your limitations that you've got in your system build, ambient temperature, etc. Just to further make the point, they provided another slide to show the difference between cooling solutions. The 95-watt cooler basically is the Wraith Spire cooler. It would be the Ryzen 7 2700 non-X cooler for the 95-watt cooler. The Prism gives you another 4%, and they provided a Noctua D15S, which is the slim version, which gives you an additional 3% boost or a 7% boost over the Wraith Spire. Now, it is worth noting that to get that 7% boost, notice it's 20 C ambient instead of 32 C ambient. Yeah, that's one of those little asterisk details that makes it really easy to miss. Put them both in 32 C ambient, you're probably looking at 1 or 2% more performance. And yeah, that's not really worth a $90 tower cooler now, is it? 5 non-gaming performance benchmarks here provided between the 2700X and the 8700K. I've personally already tested Cinebench R15, and yep, that number is pretty much correct. I have not personally tested the other 4, but frankly, these are so unbelievably easy for everybody in the world to compare. I'll take their word for it. Seriously, these numbers here are true and correct. If you are doing multi-threaded content creation, you're crazy to buy an 8700K over a Ryzen 7 2700X. It clearly is superior in this application. Gaming? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. I want to give AMD props and credit here. 1080p gaming results. When they launched the original Ryzen 7, they focused really heavily on 1440p and 4K results and kind of ignored the 1080p gaming because they knew the Ryzen 7 1700 did not really compete all that well in terms of performance charts with the i7 7700K, which was the then top-end CPU. They went ahead and did 1080p Ultra this time. These are not bad results. Yes, the i7 8700K does beat Ryzen most of the time. Not tremendously so, but it does beat it. I would like to point out that they did conveniently provide the 60 Hz and 144 Hz lines on this chart to demonstrate that both chips will run all these games at 60 frames per second without an issue, and will run above that just fine as well. Turn the detail down from ultra to high, and all of these numbers do go up a bit. The i7 8700K numbers will go up a little bit more. In fairness, lower the detail, and it does pull ahead a bit. Next generation graphics cards, it'll pull ahead a little bit as well. If you want 144 frames per second AAA gaming at 1080p, and you're willing to buy the best graphics card on the market, which is currently a 1080 Ti, and then replace it with the 1180 or 2080 or whatever NVIDIA calls it, fine, buy an 8700K. It will be faster for that application. For everyone else, 1440p, 4K, or 1080p gaming up to about 100 frames per second, there's essentially very little or no difference. In fact, if all you care about is gaming, I don't know that I would buy a Ryzen 7 2700X. If you care about the value for the money and you're going with a mid-range graphics card, a GTX 1060, a GTX 1070, the Ryzen 5 2600X may be a better value for the money. And now that they were honest with the 1080p gaming, we have 1440p high gaming here between the 2700X and the 8700K. Boy, look at all those numbers. They are awfully darn similar. In fact, most of those are so close they are rounding errors. Yes, for example, in Hitman, you can see there in the middle, Hitman is in fact a couple of frames per second faster on the 8700K. Do you really believe you'll see the difference between 96 frames per second and 93 frames per second? No, you're not going to, and those are averages, and they'll be up and down from there, but they're so close as to be essentially the same. Now, a couple of games, F1 2017, Grand Theft Auto 5, do show a larger difference. Those games are heavily Intel-based, to be sure, but look at the numbers. They're up like 100 to 140 frames per second. Now, one common complaint here is that these chips are both being run at stock speeds. And after all, can't the 8700K overclock to 5 gigahertz on all the cores? Yes, it can. Can the 2700X be overclocked? No, not really. It's at its limit. It's essentially pushed as far as it's going to go. So these numbers will get better with an 8700K at 5 gigahertz. Please note, that's expensive to do. 280mm liquid cooler, Noctua D15, Dark Rock Pro 4, a nice quality motherboard, a good airflow in your system. Those things are expensive to accomplish. In short, you're looking at about a $200-ish price difference between these two CPUs if you want the 8700K at 5 GHz. About $650 for the 8700K versus $450 for the 2700X. And I'll remind you, you can knock that down by $100 by going with the 2600X, and you'll still be pretty close to these results. Now, for whatever reason, AMD decided to provide multi-threaded benchmarks between the 2600X and the i5 8600K. Why, I don't know, because if you're doing content creation, you shouldn't be on either one of these. Ryzen 7 2700X for the win, but whatever, here they are. Yes, we're about 20% faster across the board on the 2600X. Gaming performance numbers won't look like this. Current games today, the i5 8600K will be a little bit faster than the 2600X by a couple of percent, not a lot. So yeah, between these two chips, I'd buy a 2600X. Same story, different day, 1080p Ultra Gaming between the 2600X and the i5 8600K. Again, the 2600X comes with the Wraith Spire cooler. The i5 8600K doesn't come with a cooler at all. You go out and buy a cooler and you overclock it in a nice motherboard and all of a sudden you're spending a bunch of money. Now, the i5 8600K is currently priced about the same. So these chips in terms of price are roughly comparable. Please let me remind you that the 2600X has 12 threads. It is 6 cores, 12 threads, whereas the i5 8600K is 6 cores, 6 threads. I really believe the Ryzen 5 2600X is more comparable to the 8700K, and I will show those results when I do my review on it. I will also show the results on the i5 8600K, but frankly, I think it's a silly CPU and nobody should buy it because you have to buy a cooler and an expensive board, and if you're going to overclock it, then just get an i7 8700K of 5 GHz is important to you. That's my opinion. I know some people disagree with me on that, but from the Intel side of things, it's i7 or bust. Now we have 1440p high gaming detail between these two, and again, it's same story, different chart. Basically, they're neck and neck. Without benchmarks running, I would like to point out that if you put these two systems side by side, it didn't tell you what they were, hid the computers, and had you play on them one after the other and go back and forth between them, I don't actually think most people could pick out which is which. They are so close in performance. So then it comes down to price. Well, the price of these is basically the same. Then it comes down to motherboard. Well, the motherboard price is the same, except the Ryzen 5 2600X will install on cheaper boards. It does come with a cooler, and it does have a motherboard that will have platform support until 2020, which the 8600K won't. And you are supporting the company that kind of moved the industry along, which there's something to be said for that as well, as opposed to the one that had to be dragged kicking and screaming into more than 4 cores. That's not going to matter to some of you, but personally, all else being equal, I'd rather give AMD the money. Do note that's not being a fanboy. I want to give AMD money for graphics cards too, but Vega is atrocious. And I recently did an updated review on Vega and basically said, yeah, this is just sad and tragic and no one should buy one. Because right now NVIDIA has better graphics cards with lower power consumption and better performance. So I'm not supporting the underdog just to support them. They have to have good products. This here is a good product. I hope the next graphics card from AMD has whoever designed Ryzen running it, because if they do, then they're really going to give NVIDIA a push, and that's something I think we could all root for. And then we go from those wonderful results to another marketing slide. More performance, yay, first to okay. You've seen all this before. I kid you not, these presentations they do are so long, and they say the same thing 16 different ways. But in fairness, they have anywhere between 500 to 1,000 people listening to these conference calls when they do it, so they want to make sure they get everybody covered. It's a slide that's marketing, yay! Can we give 2 thumbs up to AMD for soldering the integrated heat spreader here? Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Intel stopped soldering back on Sandy Bridge in 2011. Ivy Bridge and later have that cheap toothpaste they put under there. It lasts a long time, it saves them a few cents per processor, but the reality is it does make the chips hotter and it reduces their overclocking. This is what delidding is. If you've heard the term delidding before, basically that takes off the integrated heat spreader, that big piece of metal that you see. That's not the chip, that's just a heat spreader. Take that off, actually put liquid metal or other better thermal compound or solder underneath on the chip itself, reattach the thermal integrated heat spreader, and then you can often get several hundred megahertz more or a 20 degrees C temperature drop. It really does make a huge difference. Companies have been formed to just do this. One called Silicon Lottery, which is actually down in Houston, Texas, does this, where basically they delid chips and sell them to you pre-tested, pre-overclocked, and they run much cooler. There is no need to delid a Ryzen 7 2700X because they're already soldered, and that's why they run faster and cooler, even though they have 8 cores versus the 6 on the i7 8700K. Unlocked multipliers on all the chips, yay, good thing. Only the K chips from Intel are unlocked. All of the Ryzen chips, even the non-X chips, are in fact unlocked. The new Wraith Prism cooler is awesome. It's got 4 direct contact heat pipes. It's fully RGB, very nice. And then the Ryzen Master 1.3 software if you want to play around with overclocking, which frankly I don't think you should. So in this case, I actually don't recommend it. Just use it as it comes out of the box. The irony is I gave that huge speech and forgot this slide was next. So this is kind of like everything I just said. Integrated heat spreader. It is a better design for heat transfer. No need to delid. It's done right the first time. In fact, you really shouldn't try to delid these because they're soldered. You'll probably break the chip trying. It's technically possible, but it's very hard to do. Unlocked multipliers for the win. What's it going to take for Intel to get rid of this silly K-chip nonsense, or well, at least sell them as premium chips, and simply unlock the multipliers on other processors? With the recent launch of the B360 and the H370 boards, and the H310, which no one should buy, what they did is they came out with some additional i5 processors. They now have an i5 8400, an i5 8500, and an i5 8600 in addition to the i5 8600K. Really? Seriously? Each one of those chips except the K chip is locked with a 1 or 200 megahertz clock speed increase. That's nuts. That is way too many SKUs, and we really need to get away from that. I really hope that when the next generation of Intel chips come out, they do away with this and say, fine, all Intel chips are unlocked, go for it. The new Wraith Prism cooler is an evolution over the old Wraith Max cooler. This is not the same as they've been including for a few years. Even on the later generations of the old FX chips, they had something similar to this. This does not have a copper plate on the bottom. It is direct contact heat pipes. Basically, the heat pipes on the bottom are shaved flat. It directly contacts the CPU itself. So even the first generation Ryzen Wraith Max isn't the same as this. They have also, in addition to the RGB ring, made the fan transparent, so the entire thing is RGB. It is nicer and better. It is quiet, but it is not silent. The Wraith Spire is silent. The Wraith Spire is really silent. So if you care about the noise to the point to where you want a completely silent system and you want included cooler, that might actually be a reason to buy either the 2600X or 2700 because those come with a Wraith Spire. This is quiet, but under full AIDA64 stress testing, it's audible. Now, inside a computer case under your desk, it won't be as bad, but if silence is important, something like a Noctua U9S, which is a 95mm by 95mm mid-sized tower cooler, might be worth considering. It's not cheap. You're going to spend $50 to $60 on buying one, but it is utterly silent and a superior cooler. I've done a review of that. That'll even cool the 10-core i9 7900X just fine. At least at stock speeds. At thermal throttles overclocked, but it does just fine at stock, and it would be an upgrade over this. Do I think most people should buy it? No, unless silence is the most important thing you want. Now, there are 2 switchable fan profiles on this. There's a loud and a quiet mode. You can turn the speed down a bit, and you can turn the RGB off for, as it says there, RGB heathens. If you don't want RGB, there's a switch. You can turn it off and never see it again. The Ryzen Master software has been updated to 1.3. There are more options in here per core detection. There is the fastest core detection option in here, which basically lets you know which of the cores is fastest, and you get your boost on those cores. They know which cores in each chip, which will be different. Each CCX module, for example, is going to have a fastest core marked on it, and those will be the ones that get the highest single core boost speed. You can mess with this if you want. There's a built-in stability tester. You can do per CCX overclocking, per core overclocking. You can play with this till the cows come home. All the time and effort spent on this is going to give you maybe 3% more performance, all things considered, maybe 5-ish% more performance if you spend a lot of money on an aftermarket cooler. Is this really where you should spend your time? No, I don't think so. Buy it, use it as it comes. That's what I'm going to do, and that's what I recommend 99% of you do. If you're into open loop coolers and custom stuff and you want to tweak to the max, well, I hate to say this to be completely honest, but you're probably watching the wrong channel. And we have slides, slides, and more slides. I promised you every single slide from this presentation, and you're getting it. But that kind of says what I've already said. The final part is the smarter platform of the second generation Ryzen CPU, and actually some of these are quite interesting. I will go into some more detail on these in future reviews, but for now, let's go through each slide and cover them briefly. One thing AMD does deserve credit for is plan support until 2020. If you bought into AM4 last year and you bought maybe a Ryzen 5 1500X or 1400, you want to upgrade now, you can. Maybe you bought a Ryzen 5 1600X and you're like, well, this all looks nice, but I'm going to wait another year. Not to worry, Ryzen 3 in 2019 will also work. The plan is Ryzen 4 in 2020 will also work on these motherboards. Now, there are improvements with each generation of motherboard. You do give up a little bit, but not a ton, at least now. We don't know for sure what features you'll lose. DDR5 and PCI Express 4 are coming around then, so there may be motherboards updated with those features, but not having to replace your motherboard, not having to rip your computer apart just to upgrade your CPU is definitely not something Intel's doing. I mentioned before, an 8-core 16-thread Coffee Lake is coming. The Z390 chipset is coming. Yes, we're getting yet another chipset. And no, my understanding is that the 8-core Coffee Lakes will not work in the Z370s, which were just released less than a year ago, which replaced the Z270s, which were released. Intel's making too many chipsets. Let's all agree on that point. So this is really, really good, and AMD deserves credit for that. The next thing I want to give AMD credit for is simplifying the product line. Ryzen 1 had too many SKUs. 2 Ryzen 3s, 4 Ryzen 5s, and 3 Ryzen 7s were simply too many. Intel does this. This is just too many chips, and AMD did it, and they simplified it. Now we have 2 APUs, 1 Ryzen 3 and 1 Ryzen 5, both with excellent integrated Vega graphics. Then we have 2 Ryzen 5s and 2 Ryzen 7s. Honestly, in my opinion, this could have been simplified even more and just had one Ryzen 5 2600X and one Ryzen 7 2700X, but I understand they're trying to meet the price point and motivate people to step up and spend another $30, which I think you should, but this is a better environment. Now, there is no Ryzen 7 2800X to replace the 1800X. Yay! Well, actually, no. Since this is launched, I've been hearing rumors they may be releasing one this summer. Boo! We don't need one, but they might do it with a clock speed bump if they can refine it a bit. Maybe get that clock speed to 4.5. Who knows? If you already own a first-gen Ryzen and you're on the fence, maybe wait till the summer and see if that happens. That's a rumor, not confirmed, no official sources, but I've now seen it in 3 different places. So either everybody's repeating the same rumor, or maybe it's a prototype and they're working on it. Who knows? But for now, the 2700X is king of the hill. Random side note, for anybody who says, oh great, I'll wait for the next thing, do keep in mind that March of 2019, we'll get Ryzen 7 3700X. And then March of 2020, we'll get Ryzen 7 4700X. There will always be something around the corner. Ice Lake is coming maybe early 2019, which is the 10 nanometer shrink from Intel. Tiger Lake is coming after that, which is the new architecture on the 10 nanometer shrink. And then Sapphire Rapids is coming after that, which, yeah. So there's always going to be a new CPU release like every 6 months for like the next 5 years. Now that leads us into the new X470 motherboard. Should you buy one? Well, if you already own an X370, no, keep your X370. If you don't, I would generally buy the X470. It is a refinement. It does have lower power consumption. It does have a couple of other new technologies included, the StoreMI technology, for example. But the truth of the matter is the X370s are also just fine, and if you already have one, don't worry about it. AMD came up with a sticker design, so if you buy a 300 series chipset, well, you can know that it's Ryzen Desktop 2000 ready. This was an excellent idea, poorly executed, because you can't look at the box when you're buying online. If you order from Amazon or Newegg, they ship from one of multiple warehouses out of both new and old stock, and you can't be assured of what you'll get. What they should have done was incremented the model numbers of the motherboard and basically retired the old model numbers, just incremented it by 1 or put a 2 at the end of it or something to indicate that it was basically 2000 ready, so that you could go to the product page on Amazon or Newegg and be absolutely sure of what you're buying. As it stands right now, I can't make you any promises as to a motherboard you buy online as to whether it's ready. I also can't make you any promises that that sticker is correct. I have heard reports that there are boards with that sticker that work with the Ryzen APUs, the 2200G and the 2400G, but don't work with the 2700X or 2600X. There was 1 or 2 BIOSes back in November and December that did support the APUs but didn't actually support these. If you're buying a 2700X and you don't own a board, buy a 400 series board, seriously. If you're going to buy a Ryzen 5 2600 or 2600X and you want to buy a B350, well, what can I say? You either buy from a place that offers easy returns, or you might have to take your chances, or wait for the B450s, which are coming summer of 2018. StoreMI or StoreMI or however they pronounce it, technology deserves a video all on its own. I might do a full review on this. I honestly haven't decided yet because I am so sold on SSDs exclusively that frankly I don't want hard drives in my computer builds at all. Most of my systems these days have no hard drives at all. My Skylake X system has no hard drive. My Ryzen 7 1700 has no hard drive. My i7 8700K Twitch streaming machine has no hard drives in it. But I also acknowledge that I am in a unique position that I get sent enough SSDs, I can afford to do this because I got a stack of them on the shelf. Most people don't do that and people still use hard drives. I get that. So you'll have to let me know in the comment section down below just how badly you want this reviewed, because it's hard to get motivated when I don't use hard drives anymore. Here's the short version. Are you familiar with Apple Fusion Drive? That's what this is in a nutshell. If you're not, let me explain it. First of all, working from the bottom up, this is free with the X470 motherboards. You don't have to pay anything extra, but it doesn't come with the 300 series. You gotta buy a 400 series. Works with any storage device, doesn't have to be a specific one, doesn't have to be hard drive, SATA SSD, NVMe, any storage device works. No formatting, no partitions, upgradable at any time. You can activate it and deactivate it without having to reinstall Windows. This is a super important point. You can try it, change it, customize it. You don't have to wipe your drives and start over, which most of these sort of technologies usually require. Now, what makes this smart is the fact that it moves or migrates, not copies, your most used blocks to your fast storage. If you have a 256 gigabyte SSD, which is, by the way, the largest size it supports, and you have a 1 terabyte hard drive, you essentially end up with 1.2 terabytes of total space. You can pair this with as large a hard drive as you want. It's actually up to 32 terabytes, which doesn't exist. So if you have a 4 terabyte or an 8 terabyte hard drive, you can combine that with a 256 gigabyte SSD, and you gain the capacity of both drives. Think of it like gluing 2 drives together, a 256 gig SSD plus whatever size hard drive you want to attach to it. You get the capacity of both, and up to 2 gigabytes of your system RAM can also act as cache. Now that's cache, that doesn't add to the storage space, but it does improve the performance and it'll put the most frequently used blocks there as opposed to just on the SSD. Now, interestingly enough, it does not have to be a hard drive. Using an NVMe drive or even an Optane drive, you could have a 256 gigabyte NVMe drive and then a 1 or 2 terabyte SSD and actually fuse those together so the very fastest blocks on the NVMe drive actually accelerate the entire system. If you want a premium machine, that actually might be something worth considering. One of the most exciting parts of this is the fact that you can have one drive letter and basically merge or fuse the 2 drives together. Where I see this being the most useful is if you buy a pre-built machine. Let's say you go out and buy a Dell, Acer, or something else, or even a CyberPower or iBuyPower, and it does not come with an SSD, or it only comes with an SSD. This works both ways. You can grow your space without having to reinstall Windows. I've done many videos in the past of having to clone Windows from a hard drive to an SSD in order to actually be able to use the fast speed of the SSD to boot your system. If you buy a computer with, say, a 2 terabyte hard drive, you could go out and buy a 256 gig SSD and fuse them together without reinstalling Windows, and then boom, you'll have a faster storage solution. Likewise, if you go out and buy a computer that only has an SSD and you're like, man, I need some more space, but I don't want to have to move my files around or reinstall my programs because I want to move them to the hard drive, buy a 2 or 3 or 4 terabyte hard drive and fuse it to the 256 gig SSD that you've got. Boom, C drive, OneDrive letter, more space. That actually is an interesting application, more so than just the acceleration, in my opinion. Here, AMD has provided a benchmark, 14.7 seconds versus 41.4 seconds. This is a comparison of World of Warcraft character select to playable. Now, just like the other marketing slides that I showed you, this is obviously cherry-picked, designed to make it look really, really good, and I expect most situations wouldn't be this good. I don't know how many times they did it. It is worth noting that you have to train it. In other words, you have to use your computer. When you first set it up, you probably won't notice a big difference. After you've used your computer for a few days, after you've launched all your games, rebooted your computer several times, it will start to speed up and get faster. Please note that if you launch a game that you've not run in a while and its blocks are on the hard drive, there's no performance improvement. This assumes that you just ran World of Warcraft and thus World of Warcraft is actually on the SSD. Run other games, those will get moved to the SSD and World of Warcraft will get moved back to the hard drive. For those of you playing the home game, yes, this will increase the number of writes to your SSD. I'm not currently bothered by this because SSDs have a ridiculously long life and the average person's never going to wear one out. But if you really use your machine hard, this actually is in the background moving data back and forth between the hard drive and the SSD and does run the risk of using up your write allowance or your total terabytes written faster than you otherwise would. And more benchmarks here. And this right here is one of the reasons why I am hesitant to do a full review of this, because it is going to involve a lot of background testing in order to bring you honest, independent results. I can put up a chart, I can do a couple of tests, but I really would want to play with this enough hours and possibly over several days or a week to really get a sense of how much improvement it is. Because I can show you charts and I can time launches, but the real question is, in day-to-day use, does it provide a perceptible performance increase? Doing this will require I set one up and actually start using it and not benchmarking it to be able to just tell you, yes, it's worth it, no, it's not, based upon I used it for a week. Again, let me know in the comments below how much you care. Here we see the performance jump if you add the RAM cache to it. Newsflash, RAM's a lot faster than an SSD. Well, yes, that shouldn't be a surprise. This simply provides an easy way to do it, and of course, if you've got 16 gigs or more, then I would definitely turn that on because clearly it's faster. And of course, we now have a summary of what we just talked about. Even though we're about 50 minutes into this video, I'm about 3.5 hours into recording it because I look everything up and research it and everything before I do this. It's a marketing slide, what can I say? If any of you are still watching this video at this point, bless your hearts, I'm so glad that you're here. Now, aren't you guys all glad you weren't on the conference call with AMD where yet another slide saying the same thing again comes up and they then read the whole thing to you again for the next 3 to 5 minutes? I'm not going to do it. It's the same stuff you've already seen. Now, does this slide look familiar? It should, because it was earlier in this presentation. Look down at the bottom left-hand corner, you might see the number 51. This is the 51st slide, and yes, this slide is in here again, saying the same thing again. So very rarely do the footnotes get included whenever you see these slides in videos, and many channels do put these slides into videos, or you'll see these slides put onto various sites like Tom's Hardware or Nantech or other sites, but very rarely do you get the footnotes which contain all the details behind the benchmarks, numbers, testings, etc. Now, I'm not going to read this to you, of course, and hopefully if you're watching this on a full-size monitor, you can read this text. I am rendering and uploading this video at 4K, so YouTube should have a copy good enough that you can read that ridiculously fine print. It's there if you want it, otherwise, well, we'll move on. Thought you were done with the fine print? Nope, there's a little bit more of it, but don't worry, we'll move on to the next slide. You can pause the video if you want to read this. Gotcha, you thought we were done with fine print and slides. Again, pause it, read it if you want all the details of the tests and benchmarks that AMD did. Now, I will admit I'm trying to think of a joke about what happens when the 4th page of fine print comes up on the screen, and I can't think of one, so there it is. There is a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy joke in here somewhere, because this is number 5, and it's definitely not Restaurant at the End of the Universe or So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, but this should be the last one. Now that was the last slide for the footnotes. Now there's a disclaimer. This really is the last slide, but I promised you at the beginning of this video you would get every single slide in this presentation, and so you're looking at it. If any of you are still here, thank you, bless you, and I appreciate it. I know those last few slides were kind of boring with all the footnotes and disclaimers, but I did promise you every single slide from the AMD press presentation, and there you go. Now, the press presentation was actually shorter than my video because I gave a lot of analysis and comparisons in there, whereas they sort of read the slides to you a lot of the time. I hope you found this useful, informative, and interesting. As I mentioned below, everything's linked down below, as well as my launch review with some benchmarks, and there will be more benchmarks and tests coming. I do have 2 X470 boards. I actually have 2 more that you haven't seen yet. I will be doing a variety of comparisons with both old and new CPUs, Intel and AMD. For the next month or so, expect a lot of coverage on this on my channel. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big, huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section, and as always, video description, it's there. There's links and stuff. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. Go follow me on Twitch if you're interested in my live streams, and we have a Discord down there as well if you'd like to engage in both voice and text chat with the Tech Deals community. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.